Morning, ACC. Great to be with you. I'm so glad that you are here as well. We trust the Lord will encourage our hearts and bless us together. O Lord and my Redeemer, greatest treasure of my longing soul. Thank you, worship team, for leading us so well in your selection of songs that it's going to be right where we are this morning. So thank you. Evan was a most outstanding student all the way through high school. Academically, he was bright. Athletically, he was elite. Socially, he was magnetic. Everyone wanted to be friends with Evan. His teachers loved him. With every assignment, his was the first one that they looked at. His was the rubric. He set the bar. The football coaches, they loved him too. Could always count on Evan to bring his best, whether that was practice or whether it was game time. Practice first on the field, last off. Consummate, great team player. You made the team. Didn't matter your role. You were a special part of that team. Even in the social relationships, Evan, he stood out. Wasn't afraid to be seen sharing lunch with those that were not the most popular students. Kind of just liked to enjoy being one of the normal guys. And of course, you can't leave out the girls. They all noticed this guy, and they agreed with the reputation that preceded him, that he really was just a true gentleman. And when it came to the senior prom, there were many who would love to have welcomed the opportunity to fill the role of his significant other, but it's just that it wasn't available. The designated spot had been taken some time ago with Christy. Christy and Evan were an item. Had been all through high school, one of those high school sweetheart situations. They weren't in any rush, but they just kind of knew that they were meant for each other. Others who knew them figured the same. We say all these nice things about Evan, his academic achievements, his athletic prowess, his social well-connectedness. It's not that Evan was like that other person that we've come to know who did miracles and walked on water. Evan certainly wasn't that guy, but he was more than just your average high school student guy. And the wonderful thing about Evan was that in spite of all his giftedness and favor, thanks to his good upbringing and solid training by his parents, he never let these things go to his head. He wore it humbly. It's part of the appeal about Evan. He had just developed that mindset that whatever those things are that you value in life, that you prize, then you give yourself to it, whether that was academics or sports or even your relationships. And if Evan had to be an only child, then he was a good one for his mom and dad to have, and they knew it. And while his parents weren't extremely wealthy, they did have some means, and upon graduation, they surprised, in fact, they even shocked him with his graduation gift, his very own special dream car. Bright, shiny, metallic blue Mustang GT Coupe. Powerful engine, 6-speed transmission, 19-inch metallic wheels, and all the extras. I mean, it was very nice. He prized that car. He washed it. He polished it. Seemed like he always had it, as if it just rolled off out of the showroom. This would be the sporty, but also the reliable vehicle that would give Evan his much-needed transportation as he headed off to university and left home. With all of his capabilities, academically, there were lots of avenues that awaited him in terms of college and university programs, but it was really medicine that he had settled on some time ago. So that decision was actually quite easy. And of course, with education comes this thing that's called tuition and residence fees, and none of it's cheap. So in the spring, as soon as semester was over, Evan returned home. It's always good to have some recess. And some good, hard physical work isn't bad for the body as well. He kind of liked working with his hands, and a little bit of sweat, blood, and tears was always part of what had been his spring and summer employment routines, working in construction. The work was hard, but the money was good, and money he needed. The same kind of commitment to his studies and sports characterized Evan in his employment. He always showed up for work, not just on time, a little bit early. He had been raised with the idea that if you're just on time, well, then you're late. So it was always just a little bit early that he would pull into the work site in that bright, metallic, bright blue Mustang GP Coupe. Did I say he loved that car? Another reason that Evan showed up to work early was that one day, every second week, generally Wednesdays, he liked to book off just a little bit early. It was never a problem. That was date night with Christy. Every second week, it was his turn to plan the date. So he always found it helpful just to have a few extra moments, not to be rushed. Those were nights he looked forward to. They both did. Life was good. Christy and his relationship with her was one of those things in life that he prized. When you deem something to be valuable, you pursue it with all your heart. This spring, work was plenty. Workers were fewer. So Evan found himself working on a project all alone. Boss realized that it wasn't necessarily ideal, but he also knew that Evan could handle it. Never had to worry about whether or not he would show up. Didn't have to worry whether he would work, even if no one was looking over his shoulders. The work site for Evan was a century-old farmhouse and 5 acres of property, nestled in the countryside, but just 5 minutes outside the town. A nice spot, surrounded by nice rolling hills, beautiful forest off in the distance. It was a beautiful spot. House belonged to some elderly folks. They'd been there a long time. But time was advancing. Time had advanced. And now it was time that they were going to have to sell. They didn't really like thinking about that, but they knew that that's what had to happen. And come fall, they anticipated their house would be on the market. Wanting, of course, to maximize their resale value, they'd done some homework. They'd talked to the realtors. They'd talked to some construction people. What were some of those things that they could do that would be worth the modest investment and enhance the greater retail value? At this time, they had already done some upgrading on the inside, but this outside work had been designated as a spring-summer job. That was going to be Evan's task. What's a century farmhouse without a nice veranda? This house had one. It extended around the full 3 sides of the house. But it also needed some help. This one did. It was a little worn. Paint was peeling off. A couple of those supporting upright posts were starting to rot. They'd need to be replaced. Some of those planks had served their day. They were a little spongy. They'd need to be replaced too. But really the big job was to extend the veranda on the front side by building an elaborate wooden deck that looked out on this wonderful garden. It'd be a great place for entertaining. Evan's boss wasn't sure how long the job would take. A week, 2, maybe even longer. After all, Evan would be working alone. So he carefully went to work, designed his plans, and then on the ground carefully measured and marked out the boundaries, where each of those posts would need to go, and where he'd have to dig the holes. And so with the necessary prep all finished, brown-mouthed shovel in hand, some steel-toed boots, it was time to get to work. First day wasn't bad, but he discovered this soil is actually not light soil. It was more like clay-type soil. It meant the digging was tough. First day, he got all those post holes dug on the one side. The next morning, bright and early, he tackled the longer front side. And because it was longer, it would take more holes. But by noon, he was half done digging the front. But now it was time for lunch break. Time to give his weary arms a break and not to say nothing about his back. But just like recess at school, like he remembered, lunch hour must be the quickest hour of the day. After having eaten, grabbing a little power nap, it was time to get back to work. And after getting down about 2.5, almost 3 feet in that very next hole, he started to hit something solid, right alongside the inside part of that post hole. The soil was thick and heavy. There hadn't been much by way of stones. But Evan realized there was always a time for a new challenge. So he kept trying to dig around. Maybe he could just free it up and get rid of it. But this was relentless. It refused to budge. And the further he dug, the bigger the obstacle got. And then he continued to dig some more. He realized that this was not a stone after all. This was something else. Curiosity had the best of him now. He was going to have to see what this was. And so he dug down more, dug around it. Slowly, bit by bit, the shape of this object came into better view. It was a heavy, rectangular kind of object, almost toolbox-like in shape, but made of some very heavy-duty steel. He looked at it carefully, brushed away more dirt, looked like there was a lid, and, oh yes, there's the hinges. What? What in the world? How long has this been here? A long, long time, evidently. And what exactly is it? He found the lip of that lid, got the point of his shovel in against it, and pried it ever so carefully. It took a time or two and lots of encouragement, but then finally he felt it give. And then he was able to lift it up. And then as he looked, his eyes became as big as saucers. And he said to himself, is that what I think it is? Really? Come on, seriously. Yeah, it is. That's gold. Bars of gold. Not one, not two, lots of them. Oh my, wow. But then, almost instantly, Evan had a thought. He looked around just to make sure that he really was alone. Wanted to make sure no one was there looking over his shoulder who had seen what he had just seen, and no, nobody was there. He really was alone. And so he quickly went to work, closed that lid again, made sure it was tight, carefully buried it again, making sure the soil was all nicely packed around it. Made a mental note of its location. That would be the 5th post on the front part of the deck, about 2.5, 3 feet down, located on the inside of the post hole. Okay, got it. He wouldn't tell a soul, but he already had his idea. He just now needed a plan. What was clear was that life in the next little while was going to look a lot different. A couple days later, Evan was having supper with his parents, and that's when he broke the news that he wasn't going to be going back to med school. Going to take a little time out, at least for a year, or maybe a little longer. They were shocked. Evan, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Do you know what this means? You can't just bail like that. But Evan was resolute. He'd made his decision. The next weekend when Evan showed up to do a round of golf with some of his guy friends, when he showed up, it wasn't in his nice, sharp, metallic blue Mustang GT coupe. It was in an old, beat-up half-ton that had seen better days. Running boards a little shaky, left front fender partially rusted through. His friends, when it was Evan who got out of this truck, they were taken aback and they couldn't help but say, "What's going on, man? What are you driving? Where's your car?" Oh, he said, "I don't have it anymore. I sold it this week. I picked this baby up on Facebook Marketplace. Started my own little business on the side, mostly in the evenings, cutting some grass. Hard to fit that lawnmower and all the equipment in the Mustang. Doesn't work too great for that. But this will be just fine. What do you think?" Well, they didn't have much to say except, oh my. They did the round of golfing, and somehow things didn't seem just right. Evan was different. Instead of joining them in the clubhouse for lunch afterwards, he politely excused himself and said he needed to go. He picked up another part-time job on the weekends, which meant he hardly had any free time. Friday nights, as well as Saturdays and Sundays, you'd find him waiting tables at the local Texas Bar and Grill. Money was okay, and tips even better. Of course, with that kind of schedule, it made it hard for he and Christy to get in their regular weekday nights, date nights. In fact, weekly, it just didn't happen anymore. Instead of weekly, they opted to go every other week. It was hard for Christy to get too excited about that bumpy ride and the old half-ton when Evan pulled in to pick her up, but she comforted herself with the realization that at least she was getting to spend some time with him, and after all, that's what's most important, right? It didn't take Christy long to know that things were not the same. Something had changed. Evan had changed. He was different. He used to make time for her. She was a priority. Date nights and long phone conversations weren't a duty. They were actually the high points in the day and the high points of their week. That was getting to be now more like a clouded, distant memory, the way things used to be. Nothing like they were now. And then as more weeks went by, instead of date nights, Christy was fortunate just to get a 10-minute conversation on the phone. And then one night during one of those conversations, she got up the courage and she said, "Evan, we have to talk." And so the next day they met. And she said, "Evan, what's up? What's going on? We can't just keep going like this. Everything just seems so different." Evan didn't have a lot to say. He acknowledged that things were different, but said that's just the way it needs to be right now. He was just very busy and didn't have a lot of time. He couldn't tell her. She'd think he was crazy. In fact, he couldn't tell anybody. Everybody would think he was nuts. The conversation ended, and both Christy and Evan were devastated. And in that brief moment, Evan wondered, is it really worth it? If this is the way it has to be, is this the right thing? And then he remembered that when you deem something to be of highest value, you pursue it with all your heart. When Evan's parents learned that Christy was no longer in the picture, then they became even more concerned. Dropping out of university and med school, well, that was one thing. Selling his pride and joy car and exchanging it for that old beat-up worn-out half-ton, well, that was just plain bizarre. All of these jobs. Did he get himself in some kind of mess of debt? Is Evan doing some gambling? Is he on drugs? And now giving up on his high school dream relationship with Christy? Do we need to get him help? Do we need to do an intervention? They tried to make sense of it all. But Evan resolutely plowed forward, pedal to the metal, 7 days a week, work, and virtually no time to play. Even after his work on that Century farmhouse property was over, the deck and veranda completely finished, Evan would regularly drive by that property just keeping his eye on things. He knew that it was going to hit the market, supposed to hit the market in the fall. One day he drove by and there was the sign, "For sale," prominently placed on the front lawn. That was the day that Evan had been waiting for. Bank had told him what he'd need for his down payment. Selling of the car helped with that. After all, it had been a gift, so that was just pure profit. Regular work from the construction company, that was completely banked. His grass cutting, that's what he lived off. And all those shifts at Texas Grilled and the tips especially, that certainly helped. And he totaled it all up. Pretty impressive. He had it. Just enough. Having seen that for sale sign, Evan knew he had no time to waste. Contacted the real estate agent and said he wanted to make an offer. He had worked on that property back in the spring and had fallen in love with it. They did the paperwork for Evan's offer. It was a clean offer. No conditions apart from the financing, and that was really all in place. Evan was committed to getting the property. A quick closing date would work well for everybody. Those 4 weeks passed by quickly. The date for possession and getting the keys arrived. The first thing Evan did was throw that shovel in his old beaten-up half-ton and went straight to the property, 734 Mapleview Road. When he arrived, he didn't even see if the keys worked on the front door. He went right to the backyard and the deck. He remembered. 5th post over. Inside part of the post. Dig down 2.5, 3 feet. That's where the treasure should be. Adrenaline flowing. Even though the soil was tough, it was still easier going than the first time around a few months ago. And so it didn't take long for that shovel to hit what seemed to be the unmovable, heavy steel object. Carefully dug all around it, freed it up, cranked open that lid, and there it was. Gold. Bars of gold. Lots of them. The plan? Oh yes, the plan. It worked. Cost him a lot. You might say it cost him everything. His vocation, his dream car, his most precious relationship. For a season, lost even his own credibility as people wondered if he had genuinely lost it. But now But now, the treasure was now his. Cost him everything. And from Evan's perspective, it was worth it. It was worth it. Because when you deem something to be of the greatest value, to be of the highest prize, and you want it to be yours, you pursue it with all your heart. Well, you probably have gathered that Evan's story isn't a true life story. The stories that Jesus told as the parables, they weren't true stories either. They were true-to-life stories. Those stories that Jesus told in the parables, they didn't happen, but they very easily could have happened. And here in this short passage that's before us this morning, we have two stories. As these parables continue, two built-in contrasts that are mixed up with a whole lot of similarities. In the first one, a man stumbles onto treasure in a field. He hides it and then goes and sells everything that he has and buys the field and thereby secures the treasure. In the second, we have a wealthy merchant who searches for the treasure, the pearl of great price, and sells all that he has and purchases it. As you study this passage and you do some research and you understand that there's some various renderings of what the treasure is and who the main characters represent, some would suggest that the treasure is the church. The man who discovers the treasure is Jesus. He didn't sell all that he had, but he gave all that he had to redeem the church. Some would suggest that the treasure is actually the nation of Israel. After all, they are special to God, and they have a special place in the purpose and program of God. And your head can kind of start to spin as you consider some of these various nuances of the various perspectives. There's another view which holds that the treasure is the kingdom. And for our purposes this morning, as we continue this sermon series theme of Kingdom Come, I would like us just to consider the big picture view of what Jesus has been talking about in this chapter and in the parables. We're reminded that they are the parables of the kingdom. And we know that with the coming of Jesus, we have the announcement of the arrival of the kingdom. And last week, Stephen reminded us of the story of the mustard seed, something that started out very small but became large. And Jesus said that's what the kingdom is like. The kingdom that Jesus is talking about and that Jesus is bringing starts out small, very unimpressively, almost insignificantly, it seems. I mean, he picks a handful of disciples, not that many of them, and they're not too impressive. In fact, we wonder if they're ever going to get it. Nothing impressive about that beginning. But that's okay, because that's not where it's going to end. And while it starts out small, this plan and program of Jesus does, it's going somewhere. It's happening. And in the end, it's going to be pretty impressive, pretty magnificent. And this kingdom involves Jesus. It involves him calling people into relationship to himself. And for those people following after him as disciples and serving him. And the message of Jesus to these people, to his original audience, and, might I suggest, to us this morning, is that you need to get on board. You need to be a part of this. Jesus says you need to listen to what I'm saying. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. There's something here that you need to value, that you need to prize, that you need to give yourself to it. Because when you deem something to be of the highest value, you pursue it with all your heart because it's worth it. And so we consider our stories before us this morning. Some contrasts, but mostly the similarities. One contrast reminds us of the variety of people that make up the kingdom. We have in our first story, in verse 44, just an ordinary person, probably a peasant, probably a laborer, of which there were many. In our second story, verse 45, 46, we have a merchant. We have a person of means, not just an ordinary laborer. I mean, the kingdom consists of all kinds of people. Everybody doesn't look the same. Paul describes it over in Corinthians for today that Not many mighty, not many noble, not many wise. God's chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. A second contrast is how we get introduced to the kingdom can vary. In our first story, the man stumbled upon the treasure. He wasn't looking for it. He was just doing normal life. We might assume he was just trying to make a living. He could very well have been working the field, plowing it, or whatever. Text doesn't tell us that. But we know one thing, he wasn't looking for what he found. He just kind of stumbled onto the treasure. The merchant, on the other hand, he was engaged in an active pursuit, searching for what became the pearl of great price, the treasure. If we had the opportunity to tell our stories of how each of us got introduced to Jesus, our stories would differ as well. Wouldn't all be the same. Some of you were just engaging in life, doing your thing, thinking all was fine, all was good. Maybe never even knew Jesus, certainly didn't know the gospel. And then one day someone shared the gospel with you, how that you were born into this world separated from God. You could never get to heaven on your own, never match up to the standards of God, and shared with you the gospel. Life-changing events, but it just came out of the blue. Others of you would tell your story, that you were engaged in a search, that you were doing some evaluation. There was a great pursuit. The Apostle Paul, we read of in the New Testament, was blindsided by the gospel on the road to Damascus. He wasn't looking for anything. He thought he already had it. Nicodemus, on the other hand, he was a searcher, came to Jesus by night inquiring. How we become aware of Jesus, the gospel, and the kingdom isn't always the same. But what is the same is this, that God, by his Spirit, being at work in each situation, creating the thirst, creating the desire that leads us into the search, or working out the circumstances that our paths would cross with that certain person or persons who shares the gospel with us. And so we have some contrasts in the story. But once these two individuals become aware of the treasure, they are unanimous in their response and their subsequent actions. Let's consider a few of them. Number one, both. Both the laborer, both the peasant and the merchant recognize the value. They recognize the worth of what they discovered. They both realized that the treasure was special. It doesn't really surprise us that the merchant would recognize its value. After all, that was his business. That was his specialty. This is the area that he excelled in. He knew pearls. Like Peter, James, and John knew fish, he knew pearls, and he knew the value of them, traveling the world looking for the best. He'd look at their shape, determine their smoothness, size up the tint. He had learned how to gauge the value of a pearl. And here he finds not a string of pearls, he finds just one. And it's the pearl of great price. And Jesus is reminding us that nothing surpasses the greatness and the beauty and the value of knowing him and being part of this kingdom that he's come to establish. That to believe him and this morning to be rightly related to him as king, to belong to him and to be part of his kingdom is the greatest of all possessions in reality. In our first story, we're reminded that the banking system in Palestine is not quite the same and as elaborate as ours. In fact, there was a belief and therefore a practice that the safest place for one to deposit and protect their valuables was not the Palestinian branch of DePaco or Meridian or any other equivalent, but neither was it to put it under your mattress or in your sock drawer, but rather it was to bury it into the ground. If a thief breaks into your house, he's not getting your valuables because they're not there. They're in the ground. If your house burns or is in some other way destroyed, you still have your valuables. As one commentator says, and I quote, men of wealth often divided their wealth into three parts. One for doing business. Another part they converted into precious stones so that they could be quickly accessible and taken if you had to flee in an instant. And the third part, buried in a safe place. The challenge, of course, with that, after you buried it, if someone died who had buried in a particular place and hadn't told anybody where they had buried their wealth, then all trace of its identity and its location was gone when they died. was gone until someone else by accident stumbled onto it. Seems to be the situation in this first parable. So Jesus' audience wouldn't be surprised when he talks about someone finding treasure in the ground. And this man, even though he wasn't actively or intently looking for the treasure, once he sees it, once he discovers it, it doesn't shock us that he immediately perceives that it was something valuable. Both of these individuals recognize the value of what they discover. The second thing they share in common is that they were committed in their desire to have it. Having discovered the treasure, they were resolute in their commitment to get it. Can you imagine the folly, how silly it would have been for either party to have come to the conclusion that while the treasure and the pearl were of the greatest value, I think I'll just take a hard pass. If I choose to pursue this opportunity, it's going to have to rearrange a whole bunch of stuff in my life, just like Evan. It's going to involve some change. My whole personal equilibrium of life is going to become all messed up. Can you think of the time, the energy, the resources that are going to be required if I pursue this? I kind of like my lifestyle and the way things are right now. Yeah, it could be a bit better. It's not bad. And what would some other people think if I was just to go all in on this? I'm not sure they're going to be on the sidelines cheering. I think they'd be on the sidelines jeering, saying, what's up with this guy? What's up with this gal? And even though pursuing the opportunity is going to result in the greatest of wealth, it's just going to be a whole bunch of trouble. Let me take a hard pass. Let me sit this one out. If that was the response of these characters in our story, the commentary would be, how sad, how foolish. Can you believe what they just did? But thankfully, that isn't their story. Their story is that they were so committed and so resolute in their desire to have it that they did whatever they could do to get it. In both scenarios, they did the radical thing. They sold everything that they had, everything that was necessary so that they could gain possession. Of course, we know that when it comes to the gospel and the kingdom, it's not for sale. It's not something that we buy or that we purchase or that we earn. But in order to come to Christ, whatever is standing in our way, whatever the obstacles are, we get rid of them. And whatever is standing in our way, keeping us from serving, we're called to get rid of it. Because belonging to Jesus and being a part of his kingdom and what he's doing is the greatest possession. And when we deem something to be of the greatest and highest value, we pursue it. We need to pursue it with all our heart because it's worth it. The lines of the great hymn of Luther capture that spirit when we read, "Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever." And nothing, Jesus teaches us, to stand in our way of us pursuing the kingdom of God. And that's what happens with the characters in our stories. And they were successful in their pursuit. They ultimately gained possession of the treasure. And we can only do that when we properly assess and discern the value of what is before us. It's not enough just to discern that a relationship with Jesus this morning would be valuable. Could be a good thing to be a part of this kingdom that Jesus is building and that he's up to something. It's not enough for us just to be sympathetic in spirit with Jesus and his ideals and what he calls us to. But rather, it's a call for us to be all in. It means embracing him by faith and committing ourselves to fully following him. Being all in, whatever the cost, prizing him above all else. And Christianity is filled with examples of people who have done just that. Some that we know well, and others have names that we will never know. I'd suggest to us this morning that our passage, albeit brief, is one that challenges each of us this morning. We can only evaluate ourselves, and with the help of the Spirit of God, just how all in am I? And for some of you this morning, you can relate to what this passage is saying. You've deemed the message of the gospel and knowing Jesus and serving and belonging to Him as the greatest, highest treasure. And you're pursuing it, pursuing Him with all your heart. For some of you, that has meant hardship. That's meant rejection. That's meant standing alone, loss of promotion, being looked upon by some, perhaps even in your own family, as too religious, having lost it, gone over the edge. And there's some moments you might wonder, is it worth it? I'm here to tell you this morning, to remind our hearts that our passage says, it's worth it. It's worth it. Many of you are serving in a whole lot of different ways. You may have that same question. Is it worth it? There's some here, some that are connected with ACC, they've left home and they've gone a long way away. Well, lots of visitors here this morning. We've got some personal friends of ours, Dennis and Valerie Easton, and 3 of their 5 children. Dennis and I, they're both graduates of the Bible College where I worked in Ontario, and Dennis and I served as colleagues together for several years. They're now working in the Philippines with Ethnos Ministry. Their second oldest daughter is here at Emmaus this year. Their oldest just graduated from Ethnos Bible Institute, Bible College, whatever the name, doing an internship with that ministry now down in Florida. I don't need to remind them, but I'm going to remind them that in just a few months they're going to get on a plane with the rest of their family, and they're going to go a long way away. Just at that season of life. We have other friends of ours who are working in the Middle East, and they were colleagues of ours too. They were in Ontario this summer, left their oldest daughter studying at Bible College. They just shared just recently, as they said their tearful goodbyes and hugs to leave, their oldest daughter reminded them, he's worthy. He's worth it. Our passage this morning reminds us of that. It reminds us that when you're committed to the greatest treasure and the greatest prize, you pursue it with all your heart because it's worth it. And some of you this morning, either here or listening online, you're not yet part of the kingdom. You're listening. You might be intrigued. You might be investigating. But you've not yet come to that place where you necessarily discern that knowing Jesus and being rightly related to Him, that being part of His kingdom is necessarily the greatest value. There's a whole lot of us like Evan that prize things that are not of eternal value, and we make that our goal and we make that our heart. You might not yet know, believe in your heart, that it merits following Jesus, being all in. You're not sure if it's worth having your life and your priorities turned upside right. Our prayer for you this morning, as you evaluate and as you weigh, is that you might hear in a new way, that you might hear in a fresh way this morning, might you sense the Spirit of God convincing you that it's worth it and it's time for you to turn your life over to Christ as He comes and says, as He expresses the invitation to come to me, and I'll give you rest. The well-known story of the Apostle Paul is a reminder of one who came to appreciate and to value what was truly valuable. As I mentioned, he, like the character in our first parable, he wasn't looking for anything. He thought he had it all together. His credentials, his religious accomplishments gave him every reason to boast. But then God broke into his life in a most dramatic way at a time when he was not looking for it. And he says it like this: "But whatever gain I had counted as loss for the sake of Christ, indeed I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection, and may share His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead." Paul reminds us that when we deem something to be of the greatest, highest value, we pursue it, we need to pursue it with all our heart because it's worth it. And that was a vision that gripped the Apostle Paul from his conversion days onward, right through to the end of life. It compelled him to serve the Lord and to serve the Lord tirelessly in the joys of ministry and in the hardships of ministry, in the times of plenty and in the times of need. And he reminds us as he sits in that prison cell before he goes home to be with the Lord, that I have fought the good fight, that I have finished the course. Henceforth, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. It's a vision that sustains in life, and it's a vision that sustains in death. When we deem that Jesus and our relationship with him is the greatest prize, we pursue him with all our hearts because it's worth it. Father, will you hear our hearts this morning as we cry out to you? These are hard words. These are challenging words. These are invigorating words. These are exciting words that you call us to. Thank you that you bid us come follow you today. We may take a look around in the world and we may not be sure that on the externals that it looks like we're winning, but your word reminds us that you're doing something. Your program's right on track. You bid us to come follow you. Will you help each of us, where we are this morning, to prize and come to prize you and our relationship with you and your kingdom as that which is the greatest value. And then with your enabling, help us to pursue it with all our heart. For your glory we pray, Lord.